Hello everyone. Welcome back to Easy English Spark channel. I'm so glad you're here today, and I hope you're ready for something truly special. Just like a shepherd tending to his flock, we're going to work together to enhance your English, listening and speaking skills. Whether you're just starting or looking to refine your fluency, this journey is about more than just learning. It's about feeling at home with your English skills. So, grab your tools, get comfortable, and let's light up your English journey one step at a time. Let's get started. Chapter 1. The Quiet Life of an Old Shepherd. In a faraway village, nestled in the remote highlands of China, there lived an old shepherd named Li. His house was a modest stone cottage, surrounded by a sprawling field of green grass and wild flowers. The village, though peaceful and tranquil, was isolated from the bustling world beyond the mountains. It sat at the foot of towering peaks, where the air was always cool and crisp, and the sky stretched wide and endless. Li had spent the majority of his life in this village. His weathered hands, calloused from years of hard work, spoke volumes of the long days he had spent tending to his sheep. He had been born here, and his father before him, and the land had become part of him. The rhythm of life in the village was simple and steady. Wake with the dawn, work throughout the day, and rest under the stars at night. And Li, despite his age, had never known anything else. Each morning he would rise early, long before the sun painted the sky in soft shades of pink and orange. With his trusty staff in hand, he would step outside, feeling the cool morning dew beneath his feet. His sheep, scattered across the vast meadows, would greet him with quiet bleats as he walked among them, ensuring each one was safe and accounted for. His sheep were his family, and he knew each of them by sight, by sound, and by the feel of their wool. Li had a son, Wei, who had once shared this life with him. Wei was a strong young man, full of energy and curiosity. But as Wei grew older, he had left their small village to pursue his education in the bustling city far away. Li missed his son greatly, but he never showed it. He understood that the world was changing, and Wei had dreams beyond the mountains. The old shepherd continued his work, day after day, without complaint. The villagers would often stop by, offering kind words and warm smiles, but no one could truly understand the loneliness Li felt. They would ask how his son was doing, always eager to hear news of the young man who had left the village for brighter horizons. "How is Wei?" they would ask. "When will he return? It must be difficult for you to live so far away from your only son." Li would nod gently, his eyes reflecting the wisdom of a man who had seen many seasons pass. "Wei is doing well," he would say. "He is learning, growing, finding his way in the world. As for me, I am well too. The land is kind, and the work is steady. But the villagers couldn't help but worry. They would often say, "It's not right for a man of your years to work alone. You deserve to have someone by your side, especially with your son so far away." Li, however, never complained. He was a man of few words, and he believed that the hardships of life were simply a part of the journey. "Good or bad, who can say?" he would often reply with a quiet smile, shrugging off their sympathy as if it were a passing breeze. He never sought their pity, nor did he need it. Life, he believed, would unfold as it was meant to. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, but the cycle of life in the village remained unchanged. Li's days were filled with the rhythm of his work, tending to his sheep, mending fences, gathering wood for the winter. He found peace in the simplicity of it all. The mountains were his constant companions, and the land his faithful friend. Though the village was small and quiet, the people were kind, and Li's reputation as a hard-working and humble man had spread far beyond the hills. Every evening, after a long day of work, he would sit outside his cottage, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. It was in these moments of stillness that Li found comfort, knowing that no matter how much time passed, the mountains, the sheep, and the land would always be there, unchanged and constant. Yet, there was always a sense of longing deep within him. He missed his son, Wei, and though he never spoke of it aloud, he often found himself gazing at the distant road leading out of the village, wondering when or if his son would ever return. But for now, Li was content. The quiet life of an old shepherd was all he had ever known, and it was enough. And so, he continued, day by day, tending to his sheep, walking the fields, and living in harmony with the land that had nurtured him all his life. Good or bad, who can say? He would often whisper to the wind, knowing that whatever the future held, it would come in its own time. Chapter 2. Li's Long Days of Work. Each day, the sun rose over the high mountains, casting a warm, golden light across the peaceful village where Li lived. By the time the first rays of dawn began to touch the earth, Li was already awake. His routine was the same, a comforting rhythm that never wavered, and the world outside his cottage remained quiet. The air was crisp and cool, filled with the scent of fresh grass and the earthy smell of the soil. Li's small stone cottage, nestled at the edge of the village, was simple yet sturdy. It stood proudly against the backdrop of towering peaks, the roof covered in moss and the walls weathered by years of wind and rain. Inside, the furnishings were modest: an old wooden table, a stone fireplace, a few worn chairs, and shelves stocked with jars of dried herbs and cured meats. Everything was practical and nothing unnecessary was kept. As the first light crept over the hills, Lee would rise from his bed. It was a simple cot, covered with a thick wool blanket that had been knitted by his late wife many years ago. He never allowed himself to linger in bed, even on the coldest mornings. He had a job to do, and there was no time to waste. With a stretch of his old limbs and a quiet grunt, Lee would stand up, don his worn sandals, and make his way to the small kitchen. There, he would prepare a simple breakfast, just a bowl of rice porridge and some dried fish from the day before, enough to fuel him for the day ahead. Once he had eaten, Lee would gather his tools. His weathered staff was always by the door, as was his small leather bag that held a few essential items: a small knife for mending fences, a bit of twine, and a pouch of salt for his sheep. He would check the weather, looking out the window, to see the condition of the sky. The mountains often held their own mysteries. Fog, rain, or the occasional snowstorm could arrive without warning. But Lee had lived through all of it before and knew how to prepare for whatever nature might throw at him. The first task of the day was always to check on the sheep. Lee's flock had been with him for many years. He knew each one by heart. There were 30 sheep in total, each one with its own personality. Some were stubborn and slow, others were more curious, always the first to greet him in the morning. Lee made his way through the stone gate that led into the pasture, his old feet moving steadily over the dew-soaked grass. The sheep were already gathered, quietly grazing in the soft morning light. Lee would walk among them, his eyes sharp as he checked on their condition. He looked for any signs of illness or injury, ensuring they were all healthy and strong. The task wasn't difficult, but it required patience and attention to detail. He ran his fingers through their thick wool, inspecting each one carefully, checking for parasites, injuries, or any other sign of trouble. If he found a problem, he would take the necessary action, treating wounds, cleaning their hooves, or leading them to better grazing areas. Once the sheep were accounted for, Lee would turn his attention to the fences. Over the years, the wooden fences that kept the flock contained had begun to weather and weaken. Some posts had rotted, and others had been bent by the strong winds that often swept down from the mountain passes. Lee had learned to mend these fences with his own hands. He would gather new wood from the forest, and using his trusty knife, he would carve and shape the posts and rails, ensuring the fence was sturdy enough to hold the sheep inside. This part of his day could take hours. It was physical work, and his old muscles often ached by the time he was done, but he never complained. There was something satisfying about seeing the fence take shape, something peaceful in the quiet work. It was just him, the land, and the tools in his hands. When the fence was in order, Lee would turn his attention to the rest of his farm. His cottage had a small garden where he grew vegetables: cabbages, carrots, and potatoes. These were vital for his sustenance during the colder months. He had learned to be self-sufficient, to grow enough food to feed himself and ensure he had supplies for the winter. The soil was fertile, and Li knew the land well. He tended to his garden carefully, pulling weeds and checking the soil to make sure it was healthy. By midday, the sun was high in the sky, and the heat of the day began to settle in. Li would take a short break in the shade of an old tree at the edge of his field. He would sit there quietly, sipping water from his clay cup, watching the sheep graze. This was the only time of day when he allowed himself to relax, even if just for a few moments. The world seemed to pause for a while, and in that stillness, Li would feel a sense of peace wash over him. This was his life, his home, and he felt connected to it all in a way few others could understand. After the break, there was always more work to do. The afternoon would be spent maintaining the farm, chopping firewood, or gathering herbs from the nearby hills. Li had a small shed where he stored his tools and firewood, and sometimes he would go there to mend his broken tools or prepare for the colder months ahead. The work never stopped. There was always something to be done, whether it was repairing the roof of his cottage, fixing the fences again, or gathering firewood for the winter. The days were long, and the work was never easy, but Li had come to accept it as part of his life. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the fields, Li would return to the pasture one last time to check on the sheep. The evening was his favorite time of day, when the sky turned to shades of deep purple and the stars began to appear. It was a time for reflection, for a quiet walk around the fields, with nothing but the sound of the wind and the distant calls of night creatures to keep him company. By the time the stars filled the sky, Li would finally return to his cottage, where a simple meal awaited him. Often, he would eat in silence, content with the day's work. Afterward, he would sit by the Yao fire, gazing into the flames. The day was over, but tomorrow would bring more of the same. It was the life he knew, and it was enough. Through it all, Li never complained. He worked because it was his duty, and it was how he had always lived. There were no grand aspirations for wealth or fame, no desire for anything beyond the simple satisfaction of a day's work well done. And as the night drew near, he would go to bed, knowing that the same quiet routine awaited him with the dawn. Chapter 3. The Return of Wei. The days rolled on in their usual rhythm. Li's life, though solitary, was one of deep satisfaction. Each morning, he awoke to the same gentle sounds of the village, distant bleating from the sheep, the rustling of leaves in the wind, and the occasional clatter of a neighbor working in their own fields. Life had a quiet predictability that Li had grown to cherish. There were no surprises, no disruptions, only the steady flow of time marked by the changing seasons. But one morning, as the sun began to rise over the mountains, there was a stir of excitement in the village. Li, as usual, was already up, preparing for the day's work when he noticed something unusual. The usual tranquility of the village seemed to hum with an energy he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't a loud noise or a sudden change, but rather a subtle shift in the air, as though the village was collectively holding its breath. Li paused as he stepped outside his cottage, his old eyes squinting against the early light. He saw the villagers gathering near the main road that led into the village, a road that had been mostly quiet and unused for months. People stood in clusters, whispering and pointing toward the horizon. There was a growing sense of curiosity in the air, and it was impossible for Li not to notice it. His heart skipped a beat as he turned his gaze toward the road. A small figure was visible in the distance, walking steadily along the dusty path. Li recognized the figure immediately. He didn't need to see the face to know. The familiar way the man moved, the posture of his shoulders, the way his hands brushed the sides of his coat, all of it was unmistakable. It was his son, Wei. For a moment, Li simply stood there, still as a stone. A wave of emotions surged within him, emotions he had not allowed himself to feel in so many years. His son, whom he had sent to the city many years ago, was finally returning. It had been so long, too long. In all the time that Wei had been away, Li had often wondered how his son was faring in the distant city. He had heard little news from him, and though the letters had come in the past, they had grown less frequent with time. Wei had become a young man, far removed from the little village that had raised him. Li had never expected his son to return, not really. But now, standing in front of him, was the very man he had been waiting for. Wei's return seemed to ripple through the village like a wave. The people who had once watched Li with sympathy as he worked alone now looked on with joy. It was clear they knew the significance of this moment. After all, Wei was the son of the old shepherd, and his return was more than just a family reunion. It was the return of hope, of something new and exciting for the village. As Wei approached the village, the whispers turned to cheers. The villagers, young and old, gathered around the road, eagerly awaiting his arrival. They smiled, some clapped, and a few even ran ahead to greet him. There was a warmth in the air, a sense of celebration that Li had not experienced in years. Li slowly walked down the path toward the gathering crowd, his heart racing. Every step he took seemed to bring him closer to something he had longed for, though he had never voiced it aloud. His eyes stayed fixed on Wei, who was now only a few feet away. Finally, father and son stood before each other. Wei, tall and strong, stood in front of Li, his face tanned from years of city life, his clothes modern and foreign compared to the simple garments of the village. He smiled warmly as he saw his father, his eyes lighting up with familiarity. "Father," Wei said, his voice carrying both excitement and the comfort of home. His accent, shaped by the city, had a distinct ring to it, but the warmth in his voice was unmistakable. Li gazed at his son, his eyes softening. For a moment, he didn't speak. Instead, he reached out and gently placed his weathered hand on Wei's shoulder. The years seemed to vanish as father and son stood there, the distance between them shrinking. In an instant, "You've returned," Li said, his voice low but steady, betraying no more emotion than necessary. But there was something in his eyes that spoke volumes. He was overjoyed, yet there was an underlying sadness in his expression, a trace of the quiet longing he had carried for all these years. Wei smiled, sensing the depth of his father's feelings. He looked around the village, taking in the familiar sights that he had not seen in so long. The village had changed little over the years, but in Wei's heart, everything felt different. The streets seemed smaller, the houses more humble. He realized how much he had missed the quiet life his father had led. Despite his success in the city, something in him longed for the simple peace of this place. "I've missed you, Father," Wei said, his voice thick with emotion. "The city, it's different. It's so fast, so crowded. I've learned a lot, but—" He trailed off, his eyes reflecting a sense of uncertainty. Li nodded, understanding more than his son realized. "The city is not like the land," Li replied, his voice soft but full of wisdom. "It moves fast, but here we live with the earth, the sky, and the seasons. It's a different life." The villagers, seeing this exchange, smiled and nodded. They had always known that Wei was meant for something more, that his future lay beyond the fields of this village. Yet, they also understood that there was a bond between father and son that no city or distance could erase. The quiet joy in the air was palpable. "We've been waiting for you, Wei," one of the villagers called out from the crowd. "Now the old shepherd won't have to work alone anymore." The comment brought a slight smile to Li's face. It was true. His days of solitary labor were over. With Wei's return, the work of the farm would no longer fall solely on his shoulders. The two of them would once again work side by side, as they had done many years ago. Li turned back to his son, who stood there, looking around at the village with a sense of nostalgia. The familiar faces, the old buildings, the wide open fields. It all felt like home, even if Wei wasn't sure if he could stay. "Come," Li said, leading his son toward the cottage. "Let's get you settled in. There's work to be done." As they walked together, the villagers slowly dispersed, leaving the two of them alone. Li and Wei, father and son, walked side by side, both feeling the weight of the years that had passed and the promise of the future that now lay ahead. And for the first time in many years, Li felt a sense of hope stir within him, a hope that perhaps, just perhaps, life might offer more than what he had always known. Together, father and son returned to the quiet life of the village, where time would continue its slow, steady march, but now, with the possibility of new beginnings. Chapter 4: The Lost Sheep. The morning after Wei's return was bright and clear, the village still humming with excitement from the reunion. The villagers had gathered in the square, eager to greet the young man who had come home after so many years. The streets were alive with chatter, and even the dogs seemed to bark a little louder that morning. Wei, though happy to be back, felt the weight of the many unfamiliar faces that greeted him. He wasn't sure what he had expected, but the warmth of the village was something he hadn't realized he missed so much. Despite the commotion, Li had a routine to follow. He couldn't afford to be distracted for too long. His responsibilities as the shepherd were clear, and the day's work waited for no one. As always, his first priority was the flock. The sheep, his constant companions over the years, were waiting in the pasture, and they needed tending. "Father, let me help today," Wei said as he watched Li prepare for his daily chores. Wei's voice was filled with eagerness to join in, to be part of the life that his father had lived for so long. His eyes held a mixture of anticipation and longing, hoping to prove himself capable of contributing to the farm. Li paused for a moment, eyeing his son with a thoughtful look. Wei had grown into a young man, but in many ways he was still the boy who had left the village years ago. Li was aware that the city life had shaped his son in ways he might not fully understand yet. The hard, physical work on the farm, the quiet labor of tending to animals, was something Wei would have to get used to again. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't always glamorous. After a moment of contemplation, Li smiled warmly and nodded. "Very well, Wei. You will help today. But remember, working with the sheep is a delicate matter. It takes patience, care, and understanding. The land is not like the city. You must listen to the animals and the earth." Wei nodded eagerly, trying his best to hide the nervousness that crept into his chest. He had always loved the idea of working on the farm, of being like his father, but deep down, he wondered if he could live up to the expectations. He had spent so many years in the bustling city, learning things that had little to do with the way of the land. Yet today, he felt an overwhelming desire to reconnect with his roots, to be part of this life that had shaped his father so profoundly. Li and Wei set off together toward the meadow. The soft crunch of the grass underfoot, the only sound breaking the silence of the morning. The sheep were already gathered, scattered across the wide, open field. The early sun cast long shadows, and the dew on the grass sparkled like tiny jewels. The smell of fresh earth and wildflowers filled the air, and everything felt right. It was a peaceful moment, the kind of moment Lee had spent his life savoring. As they approached the flock, Lee gave Wei a few simple instructions. Keep your distance, Wei. Let them come to you. Don't startle them. Move slowly and be gentle. They are like the land. They respond to care and patience. Wei nodded again, trying to remember his father's advice. He had watched Lee work with the sheep for years as a child, but now that he was older, the task seemed more daunting. He slowly approached the nearest sheep, trying to mimic his father's calm movements. The sheep, sensing his presence, glanced up, but didn't seem to mind. Wei felt a sense of pride as he walked among them. They were calmer than he had expected, and for a brief moment, he felt at peace with the animals. But then, something caught his eye. One of the sheep, a strong, healthy ram that Lee had prized for its thick wool, was nowhere to be seen. It should have been grazing nearby, but there was no sign of it. Wei's heart sank. He searched the area, scanning the horizon for any sign of the missing animal. "Father?" Wei called out, his voice edged with uncertainty. "One of the sheep is missing." Lee stopped, his eyes narrowing as he took in the situation. He had learned over the years to be observant, and his old instincts kicked in. It is not uncommon for them to wander. You must keep an eye on them, Wei. The land calls to them, and sometimes they do not stay in one place. Wei nodded, but his anxiety was growing. He had never been fully responsible for the flock before, and the thought of losing a sheep was a troubling one. He had seen his father work tirelessly to protect and care for the animals. To lose one, especially one so important, would be a blow. They spent the next few hours searching the field and the surrounding hills, but there was no sign of the missing sheep. The sun climbed higher in the sky, and the quiet of the meadow seemed to grow heavier. Wei's worry deepened. He could feel his father's watchful gaze, but Lee said little, only giving small instructions on how to track the animal. It was clear that Lee wasn't concerned yet. He had seen many animals wander off in the past, but to Wei, it was a failure. His mind raced with thoughts of what might have happened. Was it stolen? Had it run off into the woods? Or worse, fallen into a ravine? After a long search, they decided to return to the village for the evening. The sheep were herded back to their pen, but the ram was still missing. Wei's heart was heavy with the weight of the day's work, and the lingering feeling of failure weighed on him. He had not been able to find the ram, and that troubled him deeply. As the evening drew near, Lee could see the tension in his son's posture. That night, Li sat quietly by the fire, watching the flames flicker in the hearth. Wei sat beside him, staring into the fire, his mind racing. Finally, after what felt like hours, Wei spoke. "Father, I couldn't find the sheep. I should have been more careful. It's my fault." Li didn't immediately respond. Instead, he took a deep breath, his hands resting on his knees. His eyes glimmered in the low light of the fire. "Sometimes things happen that we cannot control," Li said softly. "The sheep wander. The land calls to them. But it is not your fault, Wei. The earth teaches us to be patient. There are no easy answers, only steady work and trust in time." Wei looked up at his father, surprised by the calmness in his voice. "But what if it doesn't come back? What if it's lost?" Li's expression softened, and he placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "If the sheep does not return, then we will deal with it. But remember, one loss does not define you, and it does not mean failure. It is part of life. The land teaches us to let go sometimes, but we will do what we can to find it." Wei nodded, the weight in his chest lightening slightly. He still felt the sting of the lost sheep, but his father's words offered him a strange comfort. Life on the farm was unpredictable, and no matter how hard he tried to control it, nature had a way of surprising him. The night passed quietly, but Wei knew the next day would bring a new challenge. He was learning, slowly but surely, that life on the farm was not about perfection. It was about resilience, patience, and understanding the rhythms of the world around him. And so, as the night grew darker and the fire crackled low, father and son sat together in the quiet, waiting for the morning and whatever it might bring. Chapter 5. A Turn of Events. The following morning, Li and Wei awoke early, the crisp morning air seeping through the cracks in the stone walls of the cottage. The night had passed quietly, and although the missing sheep was still on their minds, there was no time to dwell on it for long. The work of the farm, as always, was relentless. The sun had barely begun to rise when Li was already outside, preparing for the day's chores. He had grown accustomed to starting his days in silence, relying on the familiar rhythm of his work to ease his mind and bring clarity. Wei, however, was still feeling the weight of the previous day's disappointment. He had spent hours searching for the missing ram, and his failure to find it lingered in his thoughts like a shadow. Despite his father's words of encouragement, Wei couldn't shake the sense of guilt. He felt responsible for losing an animal that had been so vital to the farm. The thought that he might have failed his father after finally returning to the village was hard to bear. But as the morning sun bathed the village in its soft golden light, something unexpected happened. Wei, determined not to dwell on the past, decided to start the day with a fresh mindset. He knew that his father was relying on him, and he couldn't afford to let the loss of one sheep overshadow the tasks ahead. With a deep breath, he joined Li outside the cottage. "Father," Wei called as he approached, "let's start by checking the sheep again. Maybe we missed something yesterday." Li looked up from where he was gathering his tools, his eyes sharp yet calm. "We will check again, Wei. But we do not chase after the past. The present is what matters now." Wei nodded, his chest tightening with the responsibility he felt. They gathered their tools and made their way to the field, the dew-covered grass brushing against their legs as they walked. The village was peaceful in the early morning, with only the sounds of birds and distant sheep to break the silence. As they reached the pasture, Li gave his son a few simple instructions, and together they began their search once again. This time, however, something was different. As Wei looked across the meadow, his eyes scanning the landscape for any sign of the missing sheep, he noticed a small movement on the horizon. At first, he thought it might be the wind playing tricks on him, but then he saw it again, a flash of white fur moving slowly through the tall grass. His heart skipped a beat. "Father!" Wei shouted, pointing toward the movement. "There! I think I see the ram." Li turned, following the direction of Wei's finger. His expression remained calm, but a flicker of hope appeared in his eyes. Without saying a word, he motioned for Wei to follow. Together, they moved quickly, their footsteps silent on the soft ground as they approached the area where the sheep had been spotted. As they got closer, they saw that the ram was indeed there, grazing peacefully on a patch of lush green grass, just a short distance away from where they had last seen it. It was the same ram, the one that had gone missing the day before. But what was even more surprising was that the ram wasn't alone. Standing beside it, its wild, untamed eyes reflecting the morning light, was another sheep. A wild ram. The sight took both men by surprise. The wild ram, a creature they had never seen before, was much larger and more muscular than the others in the flock. Its coat was matted, and its horns were sharp, curling in a way that gave it an almost regal appearance. It was a powerful animal, clearly not part of the domestic flock that Li had tended to for years. "Where did it come from?" Wei murmured, his eyes wide with disbelief. Li, ever calm, watched the two sheep from a distance. He studied the wild ram carefully, noting its strength and stature. "I don't know," he said thoughtfully, "but it seems our ram has found a companion." Wei's mind raced with questions. How had the wild ram ended up here? And why was it with the missing sheep? It didn't take long for Wei to realize the answer. The wild ram must have been the one that had led their ram away, and in the process it had found its way into the pasture. The two animals had likely formed some kind of bond, a bond that brought them together in this unexpected turn of events. "Father, what do we do now?" Wei asked, his voice uncertain. He wasn't sure how to approach the situation, or what this new development meant for the farm. Li looked at the wild ram with a thoughtful expression. "We wait," he said simply. "We observe. This wild ram may bring change, but for now, we let it be." Wei was puzzled, but didn't question his father's wisdom. Li had always known how to read the land and the animals, and if he said they should wait, then that was what they would do. The two rams stood side by side, grazing peacefully as the morning sun continued its steady climb across the sky. For now, everything seemed calm. As the day went on, the villagers began to hear about the unexpected turn of events. They had already heard of the missing sheep, and now they were eager to know if the ram had been found. When Wei and Li returned to the village, the news spread quickly. The villagers gathered around, eager to hear the details. "Did you find it?" one of them asked, her voice filled with curiosity. "Is the ram back?" Wei nodded, a smile spreading across his face. "Yes, we found it, and it wasn't alone. There's a wild ram with it." The villagers gasped in surprise. "A wild ram?" one man repeated, his voice full of disbelief. "What does this mean?" Li, who had been standing quietly in the background, stepped forward. "It means change," he said softly, his voice calm and steady. "It means that things are never quite as simple as they seem. We do not control the land, nor the animals. They follow their own paths." The villagers were silent for a moment, considering the old shepherd's words. The idea of a wild ram joining their flock was an oddity, something neither expected nor fully understood. But Li's calm acceptance of the situation was something the villagers had come to respect over the years. "We must be patient," Li continued. "The wild ram will not stay forever. Perhaps it is here to teach us something. But for now, we let it be." The news of the wild ram spread like wildfire through the village, and though some of the villagers were excited by the new development, others were unsure. Could they tame the wild ram? Would it bring trouble? Or was it a blessing, something new and unexpected that could change the farm for the better? As the days passed, Wei and Li watched the two rams interact, their bond growing stronger. The wild ram was proud and untamed, yet it had formed a strange companionship with the domesticated ram. In some ways, it seemed like a metaphor for their own lives. Two worlds colliding, two different paths coming together in a way that no one had anticipated. What had started as a simple search for a missing sheep had turned into something far greater, a reminder that life on the farm, like life itself, was unpredictable. Change came when it was least expected, and sometimes, What seemed like a misfortune could lead to something entirely new. And so, as the days wore on, Wei and Li continued their work. The wild ram remained a mystery, a symbol of the unpredictable nature of the world they lived in. Yet, for both father and son, it was a reminder that no matter how much they planned, life would always find a way to surprise them. Chapter 6. Taming the Wild Rams. The days following the discovery of the wild ram were filled with a sense of unease and curiosity. The bond between the domesticated ram and the wild one seemed to grow stronger each day. They spent most of their time together, grazing side by side, occasionally playing or nudging each other in a strange, unspoken camaraderie. For the first time in many years, the sheep were not just a routine for Li. They had become a source of mystery, and it intrigued him. Li, ever wise, knew that the wild ram couldn't be ignored. There was a lesson to be learned in its presence, but there was also a challenge. It was a wild animal, untamed, and its unpredictability made it a potential danger. It was clear to Li that he would have to deal with the wild ram sooner or later, for the peace of the flock and for the safety of the land. But Li was patient. He understood that taming such an animal would not be easy, and it would require more than just physical strength. It would require time, patience, and respect. Wei, on the other hand, was eager. Since the wild ram had appeared, he had watched it closely, fascinated by its power and the raw beauty that it possessed. It was everything Wei had never seen in the domesticated sheep he had grown up with: proud, free, and untamed. The wild ram moved with a quiet strength, its large body powerful and sleek, and its eyes carried an unyielding spark of independence. "I want to tame it," Wei said one evening as he sat with his father by the fire. The crackling flames illuminated his face, his eyes gleaming with the fire of ambition. "We can have 2 strong rams on the farm. It will be good for the land, for the flock. With 2 rams, we could do more work." Li looked at his son quietly, his expression unreadable. He had listened to Wei's words, but he knew that taming a wild animal wasn't just about adding strength to the farm. It was about control, trust, and mutual understanding, things that didn't come quickly or easily. "We can try," Li said after a long pause, his voice calm and measured. "But you must remember, Wei, taming a wild ram is not like raising the others. It is not just about strength. It is about patience, respect, and trust. If you try to force it, the ram will never trust you." Wei nodded eagerly. "I understand, Father. I will be patient. I will prove that I can do it." And so, the next morning, Wei set out early to attempt the impossible: taming the wild ram. Li, as always, observed quietly from the background, ready to offer guidance if needed, but trusting that his son would need to learn these lessons on his own. Wei approached the wild ram cautiously. The animal stood in the middle of the pasture, its large curved horns catching the morning sunlight. It was grazing, its head low, seemingly unaware of Wei's presence. Wei took a deep breath and stepped closer, moving slowly and carefully, just as his father had taught him with the other sheep. The wild ram raised its head, and for a moment, their eyes locked. There was a challenge in those eyes, a deep, untamable spirit that Wei had not expected. Wei took another step, his body tense with anticipation. He reached out slowly, extending his hand toward the ram. The animal flinched, its nostrils flaring as it took a step back, eyeing Wei warily. Wei froze, not daring to move further. He had to gain its trust, not force it. The wild ram watched, its large body still. Wei stayed where he was, patiently waiting, not pushing, not rushing. He remembered his father's words. Trust is earned, not demanded. Slowly, Wei lowered his hand to the ground, as if offering a gesture of peace. The ram didn't move. For what felt like an eternity, Wei stood there, unmoving, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the weight of the animal's gaze, but he refused to look away. Finally, the wild ram took a cautious step forward, its nose twitching as it sniffed the air around Wei. With a steady breath, Wei reached out once more, his hand hovering just inches from the ram. He didn't touch it yet, but he could feel the air shifting, the tension beginning to lift. Slowly, the wild ram took another step forward. It was accepting his presence, even if only in a small way. Wei remained calm, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't want to spook the animal. Every step he took was calculated, his heart beating in time with the rhythm of the ram's cautious steps. It was a dance, one of trust and understanding, and it was clear that the wild ram was testing Wei, pushing him to prove himself worthy of its trust. Over the next few days, Wei continued his approach. Every morning, he would visit the wild ram, slowly drawing closer, never rushing, never forcing. He would stand near it, allowing the ram to grow accustomed to his presence. He learned the rhythm of the ram's movements, the way it grazed, the way it moved across the pasture. It wasn't just about taming the wild ram. It was about understanding it, learning its nature, and letting it decide when it was ready to come closer. But the wild ram was unpredictable. Some days, it would allow Wei near, even nuzzle his hand gently as if testing him. Other days, it would retreat, running off into the trees or standing off at a distance, watching with wary eyes. It was a constant push and pull, a battle of wills. But over time, Wei began to understand the animal's behavior. Li watched this quiet process from a distance. He could see the changes in Wei. He had always known his son was capable, but now he was witnessing something different. Wei was no longer just a young man eager to prove himself. He was becoming someone who could truly read the land, who could understand the creatures that lived on it. One afternoon, after several weeks of patient work, something extraordinary happened. Wei approached the wild ram once again, moving slower than usual, his body relaxed. He stood in the pasture, waiting for the ram to acknowledge him. The wild ram was grazing, but it seemed more at ease today. It lifted its head, its piercing gaze softening just slightly. Without warning, it stepped forward, its massive hooves pounding softly against the earth as it walked toward Wei. Wei held his breath, but this time, instead of retreating, the ram moved toward him, its eyes no longer filled with the challenge they had once held. It was allowing him closer. It sniffed his hand gently, then nuzzled his palm with its rough nose. For the first time, Wei felt the true weight of what he had accomplished. The wild ram was no longer a force to be tamed by brute strength or will. It was now an ally, one that had accepted him as its equal. The bond between man and animal had been forged, not through force, but through patience, respect, and trust. Li, watching from a distance, felt a quiet pride in his son's achievement. Wei had learned a valuable lesson, one that would stay with him forever. Taming the wild ram wasn't just about adding power to the farm. It was about understanding the wild and learning to coexist with it. It was a reminder that true strength often comes from the ability to listen, to respect, and to wait. Wei stood there, his hand on the ram's side, feeling its strength and warmth. The wild ram, now calm and gentle in his presence, nuzzled his shoulder in an unspoken sign of acceptance. It was a moment of quiet triumph, one that marked a turning point not only in Wei's life, but in the life of the farm. The wild ram was no longer a threat. It was a part of the land, just as the domesticated sheep had been for so many years. And for Wei, it was a moment of realization that the land, the animals, and the work he had so eagerly returned to had taught him something far more important than he had ever imagined. Chapter 7: A Mishap with the Rams. It had been a few weeks since Wei had successfully tamed the wild ram. The transformation had been remarkable, not only for the ram, but for Wei as well. His patience, once uncertain, had been tested and proven. He had gained the trust of the wild animal and forged a bond that now seemed unbreakable. The two rams, the domesticated and the wild, had become inseparable companions. They grazed together, shared the pasture, and moved as one across the fields. To Wei's surprise, the wild ram, though strong and proud, had become more like one of the flock, loyal and protective. Yet, with the calmness that had descended on the farm, there was still an undercurrent of unease. Li had always known that the balance between domesticated and wild was delicate. The land had its own rhythm, but so did the animals, and sometimes that rhythm could change suddenly, throwing everything into chaos. Wei, though he had grown confident in his work, was about to learn that lesson the hard way. It was a warm afternoon, and the sun had begun its slow descent toward the horizon. The temperature was still high, and the air felt thick with the humidity that came before dusk. Wei, feeling a rare sense of ease, had just finished repairing a section of fence on the far side of the pasture and was now making his way back toward the main pen. The wild ram and the domesticated one were grazing in the farthest corner of the field. They were calm, as they always were now, and Wei allowed himself a brief moment to relax and enjoy the sight. Li was near the barn, sorting through the supplies for the evening, and Wei's attention drifted from the task at hand. The two rams were in the distance, but something felt off. Wei couldn't put his finger on it, but a sense of unease crept up his spine, a gut feeling that told him to keep an eye on the animals. As Wei walked closer to the two rams, the wild one suddenly raised its head, its ears twitching at the slightest sound. The domesticated ram, usually calm and docile, followed suit, glancing nervously at its companion. In a moment, both rams turned in unison, their eyes wide with alertness. Wei froze, his heart skipping a beat. He had seen this behavior before, but he wasn't prepared for what came next. With no warning, the wild ram snorted loudly and charged forward, its hooves kicking up dust as it ran across the field. The domesticated ram followed suit, its own body built for speed, and within seconds, both rams were galloping at full force. Wei's breath caught in his throat. He knew they were fast, but he didn't expect them to break into a full sprint so suddenly. And worse, he didn't expect them to head directly toward him. The wild ram's eyes were wild with an energy Wei hadn't seen before. Its powerful legs struck the ground with precision and speed, and Wei had only a moment to react. Instinctively, he stepped back, but it wasn't enough. The rams were moving too fast, and in a panic, Wei stumbled backward, trying to avoid the powerful creatures barreling toward him. In a matter of seconds, the two rams were upon him. The wild ram, in its rush, misjudged the distance, and its large, muscular body collided with Wei's chest. The force of the impact was so sudden and strong that Wei was knocked off his feet. His breath was knocked out of him, and before he could even comprehend what had happened, he was on the ground, the wild ram's hooves thundering past him as it continued its wild sprint across the field. Wei lay there for a moment, stunned and gasping for air. His chest ached, and his head spun with the shock of the collision. The wild ram, now completely uncontrollable, darted in circles, its once tamed demeanor gone, replaced by a frenetic energy that seemed to take over. The domesticated ram was not far behind, its own movements mirroring the wild ram's. Wei slowly pushed himself to his knees, trying to catch his breath. He could hear the thundering hooves fading into the distance as the rams charged toward the fence. Panic shot through him as he realized where they were heading, straight toward the unstable section of the fence he had just repaired. "Father!" Wei shouted, but his voice barely carried over the noise of the rams. Li had heard the commotion and was already moving toward the pasture. He had seen the rams charging toward the fence, and a surge of worry gripped his chest. It was too late. Wei hadn't had time to warn him, and the rams were too fast. In the blink of an eye, both rams slammed into the weak section of the fence, their bodies crashing against the rotting wood with a deafening crack. The fence gave way under the force of their charge, splintering into pieces as the two rams broke through. They were free now, running wild and unrestrained, their powerful legs carrying them further into the open field, away from the safety of the pen. Wei was on his feet now, his body aching from the impact. He looked over at his father, who had already reached the fence. Li's face was set in a grim expression, his eyes scanning the broken structure, assessing the damage. It was clear that the rams had caused more than just a few broken posts. The whole section of the fence had collapsed. The damage was significant. Wei's heart sank. He had done everything he could to keep the animals safe, to protect the farm, but now everything seemed to be unraveling. The wild ram, which he had worked so hard to tame, had broken loose, and the damage to the fence meant that all of the sheep were now at risk of wandering off. Without hesitation, Li turned to Wei, his voice low but firm. "We need to get them back. Now." Wei nodded, the reality of the situation settling in. The rams were dangerous now, wild, unpredictable. He had to act fast. He grabbed the rope from the nearby shed, his hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He had never felt so desperate to regain control of the situation. Li moved quickly, his experienced eyes scanning the field for the rams. "We have to move as a team. You go left, I'll take the right. We can corral them back into the pasture." Wei took a deep breath, nodding. The weight of responsibility was heavy, but he couldn't let his father down now. They had to get the rams back inside the fence, and they had to do it before they caused further destruction. The chase was intense. The wild ram, now fully free, was running with all the energy it could muster, its hooves pounding the earth like a drum. The domesticated ram was not far behind, though it seemed to be following the wild ram more out of habit than anything else. The two animals were moving faster than Wei had ever seen, darting between the trees and over the hills, weaving in and out of the underbrush. But Li and Wei were not easily outpaced. They worked in tandem, moving quickly and efficiently, using their knowledge of the land to anticipate the ram's movements. Wei was the first to cut across their path, using the rope to try and lasso the wild ram. It was a long shot, but he had no choice. The wild ram saw him coming and veered sharply to the left. Wei was quick, following its movement, and just as the ram turned, he threw the rope over its head, catching it around its neck. With a sharp tug, he pulled back, forcing the animal to slow. Li, meanwhile, had caught up with the domesticated ram. Using a steady hand, he reached for the animal's reins, coaxing it gently but firmly toward the broken fence. The wild ram, sensing the shift in the air, reluctantly followed. After what seemed like an eternity of running and coaxing, both rams were finally back inside the pasture, safely contained behind the repaired section of the fence. Wei leaned against the fence, exhausted and breathless. His body ached from the chase, and his heart was still racing from the near disaster. Li stood next to him, his expression calm, but his eyes filled with concern. "You did well, Wei," he said softly. "But remember, sometimes the wild cannot be tamed. You have to respect its power." Wei looked over at the rams, both of them now grazing calmly in the pasture. The wild ram, though once uncontrollable, had returned to its place among the others. It was clear that the animal was a force to be reckoned with, but Wei had learned something important that day. Respect for the wild came not only from patience and care, but from understanding that sometimes even the best intentions could be upended by the raw power of nature. As the sun dipped below the horizon, father and son stood together, both silent in the face of the challenge they had just overcome. The day had been long, and the work had been harder than either had expected. But the lesson, as always, was clear. On the farm, nothing could ever be taken for granted. There were always challenges to face, always lessons to be learned. And in that uncertainty lay the true essence of life on the land. Chapter 8. The Villager's Concern. The day after the mishap with the rams, the quiet village that nestled in the heart of the mountains seemed unusually tense. The usual peaceful hum of village life, with its steady rhythm of work, was interrupted by hushed voices and worried glances. The events of the previous day, the wild ram's unexpected charge and the damage to the fence, had cast a shadow over the village. It was not the first time that animals had caused trouble, but there was something different about this incident. The wild ram, once tamed and now once again wild, seemed unpredictable, and the danger it posed was real. The villagers could feel the unease in the air, and their concerns were growing. Li and Wei were already aware of the growing anxiety among the villagers. The farm was always a point of quiet gossip, not out of malice, but because of the strange circumstances surrounding the appearance of the wild ram. The animal, once part of the distant wilderness, had become a living symbol of nature's power, unpredictable and wild. And with the rams having charged through the fence and caused chaos, it seemed that nature's unpredictability had come too close to the village for comfort. Wei had been up before dawn, repairing the damage caused by the rams. His hands moved with precision, but even the act of fixing the broken posts could not calm the storm of thoughts in his mind. He felt responsible for the chaos, even though his father had reassured him the day before that these things happened. He couldn't shake the feeling that the ram's sudden outburst was his fault, that somehow he had failed in his attempts to tame the wild ram. He had been so eager to prove himself, but now it seemed like the wild nature of the ram was slipping out of his control, and the consequences were far-reaching. As the sun began to rise, the villagers began to trickle into the field, and it wasn't long before the murmurs of concern began to rise. They gathered around the fence where the damage had been done, inspecting the weak section that had given way to the ram's power. Some of the villagers stood silently, watching Li and Wei at work, while others began to speak in low voices. "That wild ram is a danger," one woman said, her face creased with worry. "It's unpredictable. It's not like our sheep. It could cause more damage if it's not controlled." Wei's heart sank at the words. He could hear the edge of fear in the woman's voice, and it stung. He knew that the wild ram was unpredictable, but to hear others voice the very thing he feared the most, its danger to the farm, to the village, was harder than he had anticipated. Li, working quietly at the broken fence, didn't respond immediately. His face was calm, but his eyes held the weariness of a man who had seen too many years of struggle and uncertainty. He understood the villagers' concern, but he also knew that the wild ram was not the real issue. The real problem was the fear that had taken hold of the village. The village had always been a place of peace, nestled in the highlands far from the noise and chaos of the cities. It was a place where nature was respected, where the land was worked and tended to with care, and where the animals roamed freely, but under the watchful eye of those who cared for them. But the appearance of the wild ram, with its untamed power and fierce independence, had unsettled this peaceful existence. It was a reminder that nature was not something that could always be controlled, and the villagers were beginning to feel that reminder in their bones. The villagers' concern grew louder as the day wore on. By midday, a group of them had gathered at Li's cottage, talking among themselves. Their voices were low but insistent, as if they feared what might happen if they didn't speak their concerns aloud. "I don't think it's safe for him to keep that wild ram anymore," one man said. His voice was firm, and his eyes darted toward Li, as if seeking his approval. "What if it gets loose again? It could hurt someone. What if it attacks one of the children? The mention of children struck a nerve. The villagers were protective of their families, and the thought of something dangerous in their midst made them uneasy. The image of a wild animal, untamed, uncontrolled, was one that stirred old fears of the wilderness, of creatures beyond their control, of dangers they couldn't prepare for. Perhaps it's best if it's sold, another villager suggested, her voice tentative but full of concern. There's a market for wild rams in the city. If they sell it, they can make some money, and at least it will be out of the village. Wei, who had been standing at the edge of the group, overheard the conversation. His chest tightened, and he turned away, feeling a pang of frustration. The villagers didn't understand. They couldn't see the bond he had formed with the wild ram, the trust they had built together. To them, it was just a dangerous animal, something to be feared, something to be gotten rid of. But to Wei, it was a creature he had worked hard to tame, something he had brought closer to the village. It wasn't a threat. It was part of the farm now. "Father, what are they saying?" Wei asked quietly as he approached Li, trying to mask the worry in his voice. Li looked up from the fence, his face as unreadable as always. He had heard the conversation too, and he knew what was being said. He had seen the way the villagers looked at the wild ram and, by extension, at him and Wei. It wasn't just about the ram anymore. It was about fear. And fear, once planted in the hearts of the villagers, was not so easily uprooted. "They are worried," Li said simply, his voice low but steady. "They see danger in the wild ram, and they do not understand why we keep it." Wei's face tightened with a mix of anger and confusion. "But we've tamed it. It's not dangerous anymore. We've worked so hard to—" "Do not be angry, my son," Li interrupted gently. "The villagers are not bad people. They are afraid because they do not understand. And fear is a powerful thing. It blinds us to what is real." Wei stood silently, his fists clenched at his sides. He didn't want to give up on the wild ram. He didn't want to give up on everything he had worked for, everything he had come to believe in. But he could feel the pressure mounting, the weight of the villagers' concerns, and he knew that this was something that would need to be addressed, whether he liked it or not. Li continued, his voice calm but firm. "Sometimes we must do things we do not want to, for the good of the village. We cannot let our pride blind us to the greater needs of the people around us. If the villagers are afraid, we must listen." Wei clenched his jaw, the tension in his shoulders palpable. He didn't want to listen. He wanted to prove that the wild ram could be part of their farm, that it could coexist with the flock. But he knew his father was right. The villagers had to feel safe, and if they couldn't see the wild ram as a part of the land, then it might never find peace among them. Later that afternoon, Li gathered the villagers at his home. There was a quiet murmuring as the group came together, all eyes watching him and Wei as they arrived. Li's reputation in the village as a wise and fair shepherd had earned him the respect of the people, and though they had their concerns, they were willing to listen. "The wild ram will not be sold," Li began, his voice steady and commanding, but not harsh. "We will not let fear control our lives. However, we will take steps to ensure it does not harm anyone. I will work with Wei to keep it contained, and I will make sure it does not pose a danger to the village." The villagers listened in silence, their eyes shifting between Li and the wild ram, which was now grazing quietly in the pasture. Some seemed relieved by Li's words, while others remained unconvinced. "We will take responsibility for it," Li continued. "But we need your trust. We need you to understand that we are not recklessly bringing danger to the village. This is our farm, and the animals are part of it. The wild ram, just like the rest of our sheep, has its place here. But we will ensure that it stays in the pasture and does not stray." There was a pause, and then one of the older villagers spoke. "We trust you, Li," she said softly. "But this is a big change. We've lived in peace with the land for so long, and this wildness is something we're not used to." Li nodded. "I understand, but we cannot live in fear. Change is difficult, but it is also necessary. Together, we will find a way to coexist with this change." The conversation stretched on for a while, filled with more questions and concerns, but in the end, the villagers agreed to give Li and Wei a chance. The wild ram would stay, but it would be watched carefully, contained, and controlled. And while there were still doubts among the villagers, there was also a sense of relief. They trusted Li's judgment, and that trust was enough to bring them together. As the meeting came to a close, Wei stood outside with his father, his mind swirling with thoughts of the day. He was relieved that the wild ram had not been sent away, but he knew that the work wasn't over. The villagers' fear had not disappeared. It was still there, lingering like a storm cloud on the horizon. And it was up to him and his father to prove that the wild ram was not a threat, but a part of the land they all called home. Chapter 9. The Soldiers Arrive. The summer air was thick with anticipation as the days began to blur into one another. The wild ram, though still unpredictable at times, had settled into its new place on the farm, and Li and Wei had learned to manage it. The villagers, though still unsure, had slowly begun to accept that the wild ram wasn't a threat after all. The fences had been repaired, and the sheep had returned to their grazing, moving with their usual calmness. Life on the farm had returned to a sense of quiet stability. But that peace, as it often does, was fragile. Something in the air had changed. Something the villagers couldn't put their finger on. The once clear sky now seemed darker, as if forewarning something. And then one morning, just as the first light of dawn painted the sky in soft shades of pink and gold, a distant sound broke the silence, the sound of horses' hooves. Wei was the first to hear them. He was already up, his feet dusty from the long hours of farm work the day before. The sun had barely crept over the horizon when he stepped outside, his eyes squinting against the early morning light. For a moment he thought it was just the wind stirring the leaves, but the sound grew louder, closer. The heavy thud of hooves was unmistakable. Horses, many of them, were approaching. Wei's heart skipped a beat. It was an unusual sound for their quiet village, and it immediately set his nerves on edge. He turned to look at his father, who was already standing by the doorway, his eyes scanning the horizon. Li had heard it too. His expression was unreadable, but the slight furrow of his brow betrayed his concern. "Wei, stay close," he said, his voice calm but firm. There was no panic in his tone, but there was a quiet urgency beneath it. Wei nodded and followed his father as they moved toward the village entrance. In the distance, they could see the silhouette of a group of riders, their horses kicking up dust as they made their way down the dirt road that led to the village. The riders were coming fast, and the sound of their approach seemed to fill the air with a sense of foreboding. The villagers, too, had begun to stir. They had heard the hooves, and now they gathered in small clusters along the road, exchanging worried glances. No one knew who the riders were, but there was a shared understanding in the air. A sense that something was coming, and it wasn't going to be good. As the riders came closer, their figures became clearer. They wore dark uniforms and helmets, their faces stern and hard. It was clear that they were soldiers. The villagers fell silent as the soldiers rode into view, their horses snorting and stamping the ground, ready for whatever orders they might. "Receive!" Li stood still, his expression unreadable, but his stance was firm. The villagers remained behind him, uncertain but watching closely. Wei's heart pounded in his chest as he took in the sight of the soldiers, his mind racing with questions. Why were they here? What did they want? The lead soldier, a tall man, with a deep scar running down his cheek, dismounted his horse and walked toward Li. His boots crunched in the dirt as he approached, and there was an unsettling calm in his movements, as though he had seen too many things that had made him immune to fear. "We come to take the young men," the soldier said, his voice cold and authoritative. "The army is recruiting. There is a war between the East and West, and all able-bodied men are to join the fight." A murmur ran through the villagers. Some of them, older men who had seen their sons leave for battle years ago, looked away, their faces hard with the knowledge of what that meant. Others, mothers, fathers, wives, stood frozen, eyes wide with shock. Wei's blood ran cold. He knew what this meant. He had heard rumors of the war, of the soldiers who had been passing through the countryside, rounding up men to send to the front lines. But he had never expected it to reach his village, never thought that the peaceful life he and his father had worked so hard to build would be torn apart by war. The lead soldier's eyes scanned the group of young men standing among the villagers. He took note of their faces, his gaze pausing momentarily on Wei. There was something cold and calculating in the soldier's expression. "You there," the soldier said, pointing at Wei. "Step forward." Wei's legs felt like they were made of stone, and for a moment he thought his heart might stop. He had no choice. He had to step forward, had to obey. But the thought of leaving the farm, leaving his father, leaving everything behind for a war that seemed so far away, it was unbearable. His father's hand gripped his shoulder, and for a moment, the two of them locked eyes. There was no need for words. Li's gaze spoke volumes. He understood what was happening, and though there was sorrow in his eyes, there was also a quiet acceptance. The world had shifted once again, and now it was time to face the consequences. Li turned to the soldier. "My son is not the only one here," he said firmly, his voice steady but low. "There are many young men in this village. Why take him?" The soldier glanced around, his eyes calculating. "We are taking all able-bodied men of fighting age. It is not for me to decide who goes. It is the command of the warlord." The warlord. The name echoed in Wei's mind. It was a name that had spread fear across the land. A man who had risen to power by conquering villages, recruiting young men, and sending them off to fight in a war that seemed endless. The soldiers were his emissaries, moving from town to town, rounding up anyone who could hold a sword, whether they were ready or not. A voice from the crowd broke the tension. "Please," an old man called, his voice trembling. "He is just a boy. He has not even seen the world beyond these mountains. Why must he fight?" The soldier's gaze softened, but only for a moment. He was unfeeling, like a man who had long since lost the ability to feel for the lives he destroyed. He had his orders, and nothing would stop him from carrying them out. "We all have our duties," the soldier said coldly. "This war does not care for who you are or where you come from. It cares only for those who can fight. The boy will join the army or face the consequences." The villagers stood in silence, the weight of the situation sinking in. Some turned away, unable to bear the thought of their sons being taken from them. Others looked to Li, hoping that he would find a way to stop this from happening. Li's face was hard, his eyes dark with the weight of the decision he had to make. He had always been a man of the land, someone who understood the ways of the world. But this was different. the fear, the uncertainty. It was new to him. But he knew one thing for sure. He could not allow his son to go off to war. Li stood there, torn. Part of him wanted to fight, to run, to scream at the injustice of it all. But another part of him knew that this was bigger than him. This was bigger than anything he could control. "I will go," Wei said quietly, stepping forward with a heavy heart. The words seemed to come from somewhere deep within, as though he had no choice but to speak them. His father looked at him with a mixture of sadness and pride. Li's voice broke through the silence, soft but resolute. "If you go, you will go with my blessing. But know this, Wei. The land will always be here. The farm will always be here. And one day, when the war is over, you will return." Wei's eyes filled with emotion. "I will return, Father. I promise you." And with that, the soldiers led him away, their horses' hooves thundering in the dirt as they rode toward the uncertain future that awaited them. The villagers stood silent, watching as their young men were taken away, one by one, knowing that life, as they knew it, was forever changed. For Wei, the war had come to him like an inevitable storm, and now, like so many before him, he was caught in its winds. But he would carry his father's words with him, even as he left the land behind. The farm, the mountains, the quiet life. They would always be there, waiting for him to return. Chapter 10. The true meaning of luck. The days that followed Wei's departure were heavy with silence. Li worked the land alone once again, his every movement measured, deliberate. The sound of his footsteps as he walked through the fields, the soft rustling of the wind in the trees, it all seemed quieter without Wei by his side. Though the land still provided its bounty, the farm no longer felt like home. It felt like a place where time had paused, suspended in a painful, waiting stillness. Every morning, Li rose early, as he always had, to tend to the sheep. The wild ram had grown more docile in its own way, still temperamental at times, but it followed the rhythm of the flock with increasing trust. The domesticated ram had grown stronger with the added responsibility of leading the group. But no matter how busy the days became, Li could not shake the absence of his son. The quiet was deafening, and every small sound, the creaking of the windmill, the chirping of birds in the trees, seemed to carry the weight of Wei's departure. Li didn't talk about his son's absence much. He didn't need to. The villagers had all heard the news. Some offered words of sympathy, others merely nodded as they passed by, as though they, too, understood the gravity of what had happened. But life in the village had to continue, and so Li kept moving, kept working, and kept the quiet, steady rhythm of the land. Days turned into weeks. News of the war, though distant, reached the village occasionally. The soldiers had moved on to other towns, rounding up more young men, pulling them into the chaos that was unfolding to the east. Li had heard little from Wei. There had been no letters. There was only the heavy silence and the nagging worry that gnawed at Li's heart. Then, one morning, as Li was standing at the edge of the pasture, his gaze sweeping over the land, something caught his attention. A figure was moving down the dusty road leading into the village. At first he thought it might be another traveler, another wanderer passing through. But then, as the figure grew closer, Li's heart skipped a beat. It was Wei. Li's heart raced, and his feet moved before he even realized it. He walked toward the road, his pulse quickening with each step. The figure that had once been a far-off silhouette now took shape. Wei, walking slowly but steadily toward him, his face dirtied from travel, his clothes torn in places, but alive. As Wei came closer, Li's breath caught in his throat. The young man he had sent off to war, the son who had walked away from the farm with a promise to return, was now back, unscathed, yet changed. Wei's eyes, once full of the innocence of youth, now held a depth of understanding that only the harsh reality of war could bring. "Father," Wei said softly, his voice hoarse but filled with relief. His eyes met Li's, and for a moment, neither said anything. The weight of the time apart hung heavily in the air between them, but there was no need for words. Li reached out and pulled his son into an embrace, his arms strong around Wei, as if afraid to let go. He could feel the exhaustion in Wei's body, the toll that war had taken on him. But there was something else there too, something deeper, something that couldn't be seen at first glance. It was the quiet strength that Wei had earned through his time away, through the trials he had faced. "I'm home, Father," Wei said again, his voice trembling slightly, though he did his best to hide it. Li pulled back slightly, his hands resting on his son's shoulders, and looked into his eyes. The weight of the past months seemed to lift from him as he saw the familiar glint in Wei's gaze. He had returned just as he had promised. "I'm glad you're home," Li said, his voice thick with emotion. "But tell me, Wei, what has happened? What have you seen? What has the war taught you?" Wei took a deep breath, his eyes distant as he thought about the question. He had seen so much, the horrors, the sacrifices, the lives lost, and the lives that continued despite the destruction. But there was something about being home, about returning to the land that had raised him, that made all of those experiences feel distant. The war had shaped him, yes, but here, in the presence of his father, in the midst of the land they had both loved and worked, there was a different kind of peace. "I've seen many things, Father," Wei began slowly. "I've seen men go off to fight and never come back. I've seen families torn apart, villages destroyed. But through it all, there was one thing I kept coming back to: the land, the earth, the way it keeps going, even when everything else seems to fall apart." He paused, his gaze turning toward the fields, toward the flock of sheep that moved quietly across the pasture, grazing under the bright sun. The war, it changes everything, but it also makes you realize something about luck. Listened intently, his brow furrowed as he waited for his son to continue. "Before I left," Wei said, "I thought luck was something you could control, something you could manipulate, that you could shape with your own hands. I thought that if I worked hard enough, if I did the right things, good luck would come to me. But that wasn't how it worked." Li's eyes softened as he listened. He had always known that life was unpredictable, that the land didn't care about plans or efforts. It just was. It took what it needed, and sometimes it gave back. But he had never put it into words, never tried to explain it. To him, it was simply the way things were. "It's not about control," Wei continued, his voice steady now. "I was lucky, Father. Lucky to be alive, lucky to have come home. But luck isn't just about surviving or getting what you want. It's about being here, in this moment. It's about the people who care for you, the land that gives you everything you need, the peace that comes with knowing that no matter what, life goes on. That's the real luck." Li didn't know what to say at first. He had spent his life working the land, raising his son, trying to make sense of the world around him. And now, after all the hardships, after all the years of toil and sacrifice, Wei had returned with a wisdom that Li himself had never fully understood. "That's the luck of the earth, Wei," Li said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "The earth doesn't care for our plans. It doesn't care if we succeed or fail. It just is. And in that, there's a kind of peace. A peace that doesn't come from getting what you want, but from knowing that the land will always be here, even when we are not." Wei looked at his father, a sense of clarity washing over him. "I think I understand now, Father. I thought I had to fight for what I wanted, but what I needed, what we both needed, was always right here. In the land, in the work we do." Li nodded, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding. "Luck is not always what we think it is, my son. Sometimes it is simply the gift of being here, of having the time to do what we love, to work the land, to live in harmony with it." Wei stood silently for a moment, taking in his father's words. There was no grand revelation, no sudden understanding that changed everything. But there was a peace, a deep, abiding peace that settled in his heart. The war had shown him the chaos of life, the randomness of fate. But here, with his father, in the quiet of the farm, he had found something even greater than survival. He had found belonging. As the evening light began to soften, casting long shadows over the fields, father and son stood together, watching the sheep graze peacefully. The wild ram, once untamed, now walked alongside the others, its wildness tempered by time and patience. The true meaning of luck, Lee realized, was not in controlling the world, but in accepting it for what it was, unpredictable, wild and beautiful. And in that acceptance, there was peace. There was no need for more. And in the stillness of the evening, the land, as it always had, whispered its quiet truth. Luck, true luck, was simply being alive, being part of the world, and living in harmony with it. Father and son stood together, the weight of the past finally lifting, knowing that no matter what came next, they had each other. And that, in itself, was the greatest kind of luck there could be. Great work today! Every moment you spend practicing brings you closer to mastering your English listening and speaking skills. Remember, progress comes with patience and consistency. If this story inspired you or helped you in your learning journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Easy English Spark channel for more lessons and stories. Keep listening, keep speaking, and keep believing in your growth. I'll see you in the next video. Take care and keep shining.